Okay, Sean, I see you there. So you just gotta find a way to join. I'm just gonna give a few minutes so that people can show up in the space, and I could give shout outs if anyone shows up, because who knows if anyone's showing up today. All right, got you. Okay, I see it. So so we're starting 5 minutes before 7, just so that we can let the people know that we're live. So that takes a minute. Okay. This is the part where I give shout outs to whoever shows up into the space. Zoned in joined. Shout out to Zoned In. Hello. You know what I realized about this? I feel like I'm mad high yellow. Like I have no melanin in my skin. You know, that's a product of colonization. They take away our melanin when they colonize us. I need glasses. It says Inisim joined. Shout out to Inisim for joining. Now, I'm going to do this from now on for the lives, because I know that when people show up and I'm in the middle of sort of introducing the IG live series, people appreciate shout outs. It has, you know, as a way of engaging with whomever shows up. So let's see. I'm glad you made it. I hope I said the name right. I think I need glasses because I can't see the letters clearly. But I think it says Inisim. I do need glasses. You know, I'm no spring chicken. So promptly at 7 o'clock, I'll start introducing the live, and then we can start the conversation with our guest. Ennis, welcome Ennis. I'm glad you could make today's live. All right, let me just start the introduction anyway, and then when people roll in, they roll in. Okay, so my name is Antonio Morales. I am the founder of the Liberated Self Therapeutic Services, LLC. And it's a private practice both in New York and New Jersey. Obviously, it's virtual right now. And my mission, I'm going to read it because I like to read it to make sure that I got all the words right, is to disrupt and dismantle the psychological chaos and confusion of white supremacy, facilitating a transformative process that will allow Black and brown folk to heal from and transcend the adverse impact of white supremacy in all the areas of their lives. And so the whole intention of my private practice is to basically heal from and transcend the adverse impact of white supremacy. That's the gist of it. And as a mental health professional, I understand that white supremacy is in everything that we do, right? So we live in the context of white supremacy. That's the society that we're in. And so as Black and brown folk or other people of color, we cannot neglect to point out the adverse impact of white supremacy. Now, when we were talking about the IG live series, this is unpacking white supremacy in the mental health field. And the intention of this particular IG live series is to bring awareness to how white supremacy shows up in the mental health field and how it taints the work that we do. And we know a lot of us, seek mental health services. Shout out to Saskia. Hey Saskia, welcome. I'm getting in the habit of giving shout outs at the very beginning. So we understand and know that the mental health field is tainted by white supremacy. And since black and brown folks seek services from mental health professionals, we have to recognize that sometimes that could do more harm than good. And so the whole intention of this IG Live series is to bring awareness to the various ways that white supremacy shows up in the mental health field and as a result taints it in the work that we do. And this is an extension of Freedom Fighters of the Minds, which is an initiative that I started to bring black and brown therapists and other mental health professionals together so that we can discuss these issues of white supremacy in the mental health field and come together not only to share our experiences, but also to find ways to be solution focused so that we can make a difference in the mental health field overall. And so this is just an extension of our initiative that we meet once a month, and this is basically an offshoot of that. So I'm going to go into talking about my guest today. His name is Shan Reeves. He's an LCSW. And Shan Reeves and I, we known each other from my previous workplace. And what I got to say about this man is that he's super courageous, because in my previous workplace, we were dealing with, a discriminatory workplace. It wasn't, it wasn't equitable. And, for people of color who sort of spoke up and had their own mindsets, we would get backlash. And so we had a team, the Justice and Equity team, that I was spearheading. And Shan Reeves came in as a new person, a new staff member, and he quickly joined us and sort of advocated on the behalf of other black and brown colleagues and other colleagues of color. And since then, I've always respected him, because as a new staff member, to join us in a culture that's mostly white, or in a space that's mostly white, is pretty risky. And so I give Shan Reeves all the props for, joining our efforts and, joining our advocacy work, because we really made a difference in that space. And there was a residual impact, obviously, later on, as we've seen things change because of our advocacy work. So big up to Shan Reeves for that. I felt he would be the perfect next person to come in and share about his own perspectives on white supremacy and how it shows up in the mental health field. And so I'm going to have him join now so that we can get this conversation going. All right, now, here we go. Mr. Shan Reeves, you there? Where did you go? Oh, there.
All right.
What up, my
My
brother?
man. What's up, fam? Nothing much, bro. Nothing much. Really glad to be here. Really appreciate you for putting this on and being able to start and expand yourself in the way that we talked about
Yes.
prior to you leaving
And, like
leaving
I
the
said,
school.
shout out to you for joining us in our advocacy work. I mean, that took a lot of courage, especially because you was a new staff member. And, it's not easy being in, white dominant spaces and sharing our truths, because we deal with the backlash often. And so I really admire you for that. And so I just wanted to make sure that I said it again so that you can.
Well, I appreciate you putting the landing strip there for me to land in there and come on in nice and smooth, and be able to use my voice and not be worried about hanging out there alone to dry.
So before we
It's
begin,
important to be
Sean,
able to stand with somebody.
How's your day going?
Listen, it's a good day, man. It's a good day. I actually ran into a couple of young brothers today and was able to open their mind up to spreading their wings and living in their authenticity, up in the midst of being in a mainly white institution. So, and seeing their response, they took the pen out and took some notes. So yeah, I felt good about that.
Yo, I love that flag behind you.
Felt good about that.
That flag, I gotta get one. I gotta get that flag. I love that flag. So
Yeah,
did you notice
it.
my hat? I'm wearing this because of the Super Bowl, right? Because I'm feeling real hip hop right now. And so I'm paying homage to the artist that feeling real old school.
Look, it's a step, right? Like, who would have thought
Right, right.
Snoop and Dre being able to be at the
Yeah,
Super Bowl, right?
exactly.
Like that the
So,
culture is everywhere now.
before we begin, before you introduce yourself, I like to do an icebreaker with every guest. And the intention of the icebreaker is basically to have us basically pay respect to our ancestors or the people we come from. So I'm going to ask you this as an icebreaker. So the question is, when you think about your people, where are your ancestors from? Where do your ancestors come from? Name them and think about the positive characteristics that you've inherited or attributes that you inherited from them. And let me know how that shows up in your life today.
So I have people from down south in Virginia and a small town called Holland, Virginia, that doesn't exist anymore. And I have other family members from Richmond and other families from North Carolina. But, you know, my family in particular from Holland, Virginia, they were, you know, for all intents and purposes, they were light. They were, if you saw my grandmother, like, you would think she was white, except for back in her day, they were so racist that they could tell that she was
Right.
black because her family members looked whiter than her. And so they thought that her parents weren't her parents because she was her hair was too curly. So that's how racist they were. That people that looked white weren't white enough. Like, it was like that one drop rule going on. So they come from that long lineage. And then, you know, many of our family members were sharecroppers and had their own farms, and couple that actually got to 40 acres and a mule and came from that experience. And so that hard work ethic, you know, my great grandfather, one of my great grandfathers, he and his family, you know, they moved up here and they were, you know, he was a police officer in Newark. And, you know, to make the ends meet, you know, he had his side hustle,
Yeah.
and he used that power to empower the people underground, you know. And so that revolutionary type of thought, my grandfather, who was an immense man who always was able to bring to the table his experience of what it was like growing up in those days and being on trains and having to curtail his life to that of white folks because it was his life or death, right? You know, the idea that he couldn't go into a YMCA and, right, like the youth Christian, whatever, right? It's supposed to be this Christian-based organization, but the black people got to walk through the back door. And he was a soldier at the time, right? He's fighting for this country, but he can't be let in through the front door because he's a black man. And so hearing those stories and hearing those experiences really lent into my, you know, identity of having to fight for things. I have my Uncle Larry, who's always been a very revolutionary individual. He went to Princeton, and like, he always spoke about Malcolm X, and he always spoke about like hearing the speeches and the Black Panther Power movement, and like being part of that growing up, hearing those stories has invigorated that in me. Having gone to a predominantly white neighborhood, growing up in a predominantly white community, and going to a white university, which it was still divided in that community between Italians, Polish, Jewish, right? So like they were, you know, still segregated amongst themselves in that space. So you add a speck of color, you can only imagine what that was like, right? You know, I remember having the experience walking down the street. This was before we had power locks in all the cars. It was me and one other brother. We was walking down the street, my boy Jazz, and I swear to God, to this day, this dude grew tentacles, and his arms went pop, 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 and he hit all four of his daggone power of his locks in his car, like we was coming to get his old beat up Oldsmobile. I still remember it was a brown gold Oldsmobile, and he slapped every one of those bad boys like we was coming to get that old piece of crap. It was crazy. So like having those experiences, growing up in those spaces, and having family that, like I said, look white as white can be, and, you know, knowing the understanding of that, knowing that part of my family was German, and like some of that experience that had to have gone on in the brutality of my people and my women, that are part of my life, and ancestry, knowing what they had to go through has built me into this space of being able to advocate, push, and look to the identity of
So
authenticity
basically,
for
you
all
inherited
people
like a
in any place they
revolutionary
take.
spirit. That's what I'm hearing.
Oh
Yeah,
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 no,
yeah.
no, no, no. It's in the blood, man. It's in the blood. I sat around far too many conversations
That's why you
for
was
it not
able to join us
to
so
be in
quickly
my
when you came
spirit.
into the new space, because that revolutionary spirit was already there with you.
Well, for 11 years, I worked in institutions and corrections, and so I saw a lot of
Okay.
mistreatment of young Black and brown kids, and it and it's their institution, right? Like it's custody's institution, and so for me, it was a really, I'll be damned if I'm going to go to a space that's supposed to be of higher education, and I have a voice
Mhm.
where I was muted in another
Right, right,
space.
right.
I'm not. I'll never be muted like that again. And now I could have
Uh-huh.
conversations with the administration because they were Black and brown folk, and it would be very much
Uh-huh.
like the scene from Lean on Me with Robert Guillaume and Robert Freeman, Morgan Freeman, after the like the school board, and he's like, contrary to
Yeah, yeah,
popular
yeah.
belief, I'm the HNIC around here. Now let's go get some lunch, right? And so we could have those heated debates as administration, clinician, what was best for them. But at the end of the day, the
That's right.
people that were the boys in blue ruled the roost. And so we could only make but so much
Yeah,
change before it would fall on deaf ears. And so that's just a whole nother element of this that has built up inside of me to fight and
yeah, I
push
hear
for the
that. So that
identity of
that's
our
a real
people and
interesting sort
freedom.
of experience that sort of brought you to today. You know, it's funny when I was listening to you, you was talking about like some of your family members being sort of light skinned. I was just complaining about feeling like my melanin gone. Like in the winter, I'm super like white and high yellow, and during the summer, I'm darker. But it's like it makes me have a complex when I lose my color, right? Because not supposed to be like this light. I'm supposed to be either like in Puerto Rico where we got colonized, or in Africa, right, where people originated from, and I'm supposed to have some color. So I have a real complex about that situation. But anyway, thanks for that introduction.
But
What it does is allow other people to reflect on their own families and see what positive attributes or characteristics they inherited themselves. So now, with that being said, formally introduce yourself. Like, what is your obviously you're Shan Reeves, you're a licensed clinical social worker. So where do you work now, and what kind of work do you do?
so Shan Reeves. I'm working at Rutgers with students that are in trans.
Mhm.
The amazing part of that is that a college institution
Wow.
is pretty much no different
Whoa.
than a prison institution, to be 100 with you. Um, but in my work, I do a lot of really trauma informed care, being really intentional about upbuilding and uplifting our people, our students, to understand authenticity. I'm trained in EMDR therapy, so that's a way of another trauma-based therapy to really help people link in and
Yeah.
connect to some of their own past experiences and move past some of those experiences. I have my own private practice, and I really do specialize with families, youth, and transition. People in any type of transition is really where I live at. And I'm looking to be more out there and expand myself into opening the doors to more public speaking and engaging and having these conversations and being in spaces to have these conversations so that people are being empowered and being enriched and not allowing the voice of the revolution to die, right? Many times, like we look at what happened during the pandemic, there's all the outcry and then kind of things start to settle down, but we still need to keep this conversation alive
Yeah.
and never let it to fall to
And I think
silence,
when we when
and
I'm
keep
thinking
pushing
about
that.
like us being mental health professionals or practitioners, like part of what we do has to be revolutionary work. We can't talk about mental health without the liberation of Black and brown folk. You just can't talk about it. Like it doesn't make any sense, right? And so I think that's an important sort of
No.
component to keep at the forefront, because it's real. Like that's really real. Now, so as you talk about your current workplace, what had you become a mental health professional? What inspired you to become a mental health professional?
My life's journey. So when to be quite frank with you, I went into college. I was like, oh, I'm going to do computer science and I'm going to, create video games. And then like, quite frankly, I was like, oh, I've always been a hero in a video game. I'm going to create a game to be the villain. And so for all intents and purposes, I could have built Grand Theft Auto. Obviously,
Yeah.
that did not speak to my soul, did not speak to my spirit. And as I sat in classes and based off of some of my own personal experiences and death and loss and traumas of my own family and understanding those experiences, I was able to connect with the identity of psychology and sociology and how the community is impacted by the individual,
That's
but how
right.
much the individual is impacted by the
Right.
community, which brings me to social work, right? Because that's the mix and the bond of the two. And so being able to reflect on how those two connect and relate brought that, it was a
Hmm.
very innate thing inside of me and brought that out of me because it was always understanding how, having lost both of my parents at a young
Hmm.
age, that I was a very fragile individual, and that had I not
Hmm.
had a strong community around me and my family, I would have
Right.
been those
Right.
same kids that I was treating in that prison. I could have been that kid in foster care that I treated that
Yeah.
was aging out of foster care and had nobody to go to. And so a real respect for my family and the love that they displayed to me to
Mm.
help me to
Yeah.
grow into the individual that I am. And so that really pulled me into that and understanding that there are a lot of people that are enduring and experiencing this in this life, and being able to help pull them out of that space and understand their own value in
Right.
places where other people may not give them the value that they deserve
Right.
because of their whatever their experience is, right? But being able to see life through our own lens for
Yeah.
our own purpose and build our own selves up, and not in the identity of
Yeah.
pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I got to be clear on that, right? It's not that identity.
Yeah.
It's in the identity that you have value in whatever you do,
Yes.
no
And
matter
I
where
think
you're
that's so
at,
important
you have
because we're
value.
so conditioned to think and believe that we don't have any value. Right. And so when you have therapists that come in and look like us and then sort of reinforce positive things into, sort of, it's almost like having us, teaching us new ways of thinking about ourselves. I think that really is powerful because,
Right.
I'm sure you can relate to this, but I know that a lot of the work that I've done has been with Black and brown folks, and me sort of instilling new values into them about themselves. That's that's all they need sometimes, right? It's like, wait, but you have some worth and value. What are you talking about? You know what I'm saying? Like, why you trip? And I get that because I used to experience
Right,
myself as
right.
having a
Like,
worth and value as well. So I understand, where they're coming from.
word. I mean, like, for if I had a penny for every time I heard,
Right, right,
I never thought about it that way,
right,
or I really need to hear that about me. I could have all types of institutions just if I had a penny for every time I
right.
heard that. I make mad money that way. So, but yeah, I think that's a very important part is people don't recognize their own value based off of the brainwash that we all experience growing up, right? No matter where we come from, we are
Yeah.
brainwashed because we come into this world as a blank slate for all intents and purposes. Obviously the chemical pieces, whatever, but we're all blank slates and we are picking up what people are putting down. And most
That's
of the
right.
time it's through our observation and our hearing, not
Mm-hmm.
through actual discussion and processing. And so many times we can find ourselves in spaces as kids where we see things going on or people expressing themselves in certain ways. And when they're doing that, we're interpreting that in a certain way as a kid. And so we embody that in some way where parents need to be having these emotional conversations like, well, I said that to you. What did you feel? What did you experience in that moment? So that they can be in touch with their authenticity of what's going on for them and gain clarity, because my expression of frustration and anger may not be
Yeah, right.
frustration and anger. It's just what the perception is, right? Because of how my face looks, but how my posture is, I could just be passionate.
No,
I could just be emboldened in that moment and
no.
feeling myself. And I'm not mad at anything,
Listen,
but
I know.
it could
Listen,
come off that way.
I've been accused of being an aggressive, angry black or brown man, and people don't give me no space to just be a human being. So I get that. So obviously, we're talking about white supremacy, unpacking white
Yeah.
supremacy in the mental health field. In your own words, and there's no right or wrong answer to this. How would you define white supremacy?
So I've thought about this, and I have a couple of identities in which one is its purpose, and that is to uphold the status quo in the civilization of society for those who are financially wealthy, rich, the owners of properties and things of that nature, mainly the government. It's a space holder for the status
Mm-hmm.
quo, because it keeps people in check. I identify it as a verb, as his way of taking or stripping anyone of their identity and or culture or authenticity to fit into a mold of someone else's desired interaction of life and being. And so I say this, what I say next is not to excuse in any way, shape, form, or fashion the brutality that our people have experienced. But in this country specifically, white people have been under the influence of white supremacy, and that, right, when you look at Italian, Polish, many, the Jewish community is probably the only community that has really withstood the test of time. But in the many white communities, they have broken down because they've lost their ancestry and their ethnicity, and it's gotten further and further away.
Right.
But it was all in the name of capitalism. They needed to strip them of that identity so that they had no identity, as much as the black and brown people, so that they can then point the finger at the black and brown people and say, this is why you lost your identity, because they are getting rights. And so now this causes this dichotomy in our society that allows for people to be on this side or that side. And now it's shifted from the haves and the have-nots with finances in those avenues. And then it's, Democrat, Republican, right? And like, we ain't got to be none of that. But in the identity of white supremacy, it tricks people into believing that we have less in common than we actually do, right? Because if all of us that lived under the $1 million mark in our salary were to unite and push back against society and those who have millions and billions of dollars, we'd outnumber them by far, and we could absolutely change this whole country, right? And that's just in the black and brown community. That isn't even talking about joining forces with white people, right? But like, that's just in the black and brown community. But we have to be able to be intentional about that stuff. And so it's a tool that uses people to strip other people of who they are, right? And it goes across all boundaries, right? And I'm going to get hate on this, and I'm sure, and I'm okay with it, right? But even in a religious standpoint, right, people put their own moral values into a religious standpoint. And as a Christian, right, like it says, listen, love thy neighbor and love thy God with all their heart, right? God, who does we have to answer to? God. We don't have to answer to humankind, right? And so if there is a black person in a black church telling another black person, oh, you're part of the LGBT community, you're not accepted, you're acting in white supremacy, right? So there's just because they skin folk don't mean they kin folk, right? They can be acting in white supremacy. And so anytime we're oppressing someone else, we're acting in white supremacy.
What was clear about your definition was basically the full erasure of somebody else's identity, ethnicity, right? When you talk about the other groups, like, Italians or Polish, like it's really the stripping away of what makes them who they are, right? And so that's a really important example, because oftentimes people from ethnicities like Italian or Polish and so on and so forth, they don't understand how they've been stripped as well because of the idea of white supremacy in this country. So that was a real important sort of thing to point out.
Right.
Now, with that being said, when you're thinking about white supremacy, can you give us at least 3 examples in the mental health field? Like, how does it show up in the mental, just brief examples. You don't have to go into any of them, but just 3 examples of how you see white supremacy show up in the mental health field specifically.
First, it shows up in the diagnostic tools, right? It's in the DSM and any other batteries of tools. They're pretty much all done with white males, maybe some white females, but pretty much they're Eurocentric in their identity. And so that does not apply to us as black and brown folks. And they don't take into account trauma and the experience of life that trauma brings, and how trauma ultimately can reflect a mental illness. It can be, when we express and respond to trauma, it may look like a mental illness, and it's not. The other parts that I look at are that because of the hoops that people have to jump through and the financial hardships that it takes to become a mental health professional, it impacts the ability for Black and brown people to be
Yeah.
mental health professionals. It's a battle to get to this space.
Real bad.
It's a battle to get to where we want to be able to support our people, right? And so just the educational process, and not saying that there's no value in the education, but the route and how it has to go is one that impacts the whole entire landscape. And, for instance, I did a workshop or outreach to one of the campus supporters of the Latin groups in at Rutgers at the CLAC, and they wanted resources for the Latinx population, and I looked high and low and low and high, and I was like, struggling, and I came up with about 4 viable resources, and that just makes no sense. That makes no sense that I can only come up with 4 in the whole entire state of New Jersey, given our population.
You're saying that, and I just want to add something, because when we talk about sort of the access, like having us as mental health professionals having access to doing our work, there was a real effort to not have us do our work. And I think about, my own private practice as a resource, and I think about even when I was working in particular spaces, like I didn't have permission to do my work, even though I was hired to do my work. Like I had to deal with the gatekeepers who were, in my opinion, white supremacists, who wouldn't allow me to do my work because of the perceptions of what they thought my work was. And I'm listening to, so that doesn't only happen in like work environments. We're talking about outside of this particular work environments, overall in our communities, right? When we're thinking about resources for the Latino or Latinx population, you're looking for resources, you can't find them. And that's because of the gatekeeping that happens because of white supremacy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think, that and what you're saying is that part of, and how it's a life suck, right? Like it's exhausting to have to fight that type of battle, just to do what you want to do. And that's support and care for your people, right? Like that's a real life suck. I do think, and I will say the third thing is probably the most impactful, is that insurances get to dictate people's mental health. That they get to say, oh, they get this many sessions, as if they know what this person's been through, what their experience has been, and how that is to, be played out, and how fast you should be able to heal them through as a therapist or a clinician in that process. And I think it's absolutely absurd. And I mean, it's something that goes through all of the medical field, right? And doctors, and like what medical care you can get from here to there. There's no standard. Like one state you can have, a $50,000 procedure, and the next state it can be 10,000, right? And like you can be in the same state and pay one price for one thing, and be south in that state and pay a lesser price, or whatever it is, right? Like these things are just, the insurance companies have not gone to school to determine these factors, yet they get so much of a say in the experience of people. And, Chris Rock said it best, right? Like with insurance, it's like in case shit happened, right? Like if shit don't happen, shouldn't you get your money back, right? But they're just literally taking money in. You got to have car insurance, right? Like, but you ain't had an accident in 10 years. Why insurance, right?
It should be like, it should be saved up somehow. There should be a savings for insurance. It shouldn't like disappear each month.
And so, no, but that's what happens. And so in those experiences, and they mandate it too, right? Like those are all fractions and identities of that capitalistic system that use white supremacy to hold things in place, right? And so I think that's a big part of how all of these pieces tie together, of how people are making money off the backs of other people, but then also dictating how they can do the work through the insurances, and saying, oh, no, you can't. You've been in therapy too long, right? But as if they know what that person's life has been through.
Now, I hope because the next part is I want to have you expand on, right? Oh, wait, before you go there, what do you, expand on one. So you named 3, right? So you could take one of those and expand on it further and sort of illustrate like a specific example that you've seen yourself in your work. and how that's impacted either yourself or the client or the work you do?
Sure, sure. So, I mean, just in itself, just the identity of the insurance piece, right? Um, I know a lot of Black and brown therapists that don't get on the panels because of that very thing, right? They get dictated, oh, you can only have this many sessions. And as a therapist for myself, it's negligible to say I can only have 8 to 10 sessions with somebody who's coming in
That's right.
and exposing a sexual victimization and having to justify that and put their business out in that way in some capacity, right? One is not fair to them. And then they have to jump through the hoops and I have to document and justify
Right.
it.
Right.
And they still may
Right.
not say, okay, right? And then you've opened this person up to a space that they have to close on their
Right.
own, and that's just
Yeah.
not right. It's negligible, right? And you have a person in a raw space that's dealing with these
Mm-hmm.
things and now they don't have the support that they need. So that's a
Yeah.
piece of things that is very impactful. Right. And so then, right, ultimately then people don't wind up getting services because there are not enough accessible Black and brown therapists, right? And or right? The Black and brown therapists that have their private practices, they'll get on like Medicaid to give their gift back, and then they're inundated with those clients, and they're not getting paid their value, and so they're getting burnt out. The clients are getting a burnt out therapist, and then it kind of goes downhill. And so, if people are not, you know, mindful of how they do their self care as therapists, they're ultimately not going to be worth what their value is, and they're not going to
Best.
be able to perform at the level that their clients need. And so that really is a huge impact of how insurance runs our
Yes.
industry and runs the medical industry in general. And clients that, are desperate, that will literally
Uh-huh.
go above and beyond to pay, and the financial stress that it places on
Mm-hmm.
them because they recognize how fragile they are
Mm-hmm.
in their own mental
Mm-hmm.
health, that they need it and they have to have it, and they find somebody who they connect with, and then they have to bend over backwards to keep that connection, right? Or in some cases, the
Right.
clinician will drop their fees,
Yes.
right? And then the person feels guilty about not paying the full fee, and it's like you got to go like, no, don't feel guilty. It's okay. I'm doing this because I want to take care of you. I want to make sure you're okay and that you can be healthy. And then that person will inevitably start to slip
Right.
on their sessions because they feel guilty. They're like, oh, I'm not paying. I shouldn't do this. And
That's
so
right.
and then it plays into their own self-worth, right? And so there's this adverse effect of people not being able to have resources based off of their insurance, and how that impacts them overall and through their whole life experience of doing clinical work, being in therapy, and being able to navigate the two.
Yo, and it feels, you know what?
And it's
Like
just
even the way
damaging.
you just
It's
described it, it feels
damaging.
mad like on purpose. Like that's not unintentional. That's intentional. Like there's no way that when you think about
Mm-hmm.
the way you just described those pieces, like it feels so on purpose, right? Like for us not to really get the mental health services or health services in general, for our communities, right? Like, and we've seen that in COVID, right? How that showed up, right? The disparities in health services or how people access mental health, and how that caused people to die, right? And so it's like it just boggles my mind that this is the world we live in, and we're supposed to, as mental health professionals or therapists or clinicians, we're supposed to do the best work that we can, even in the face of all these barriers and obstacles, not only for ourselves as mental health professionals or clinicians or therapists, but for the client as well, right? It almost feels like a lose-lose situation, no matter which way you slice it.
Well, let's call a spade, right? There is
That's
no
right.
money in people being healthy. The people that you can
That's right.
actually serve over and over again are the
That's right.
people, if you can get them hooked on their meds. If you can get them hooked on having to see a psychiatrist, then you know what? They'll get the money because they have a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist is going to recommend mental health as long as they're on the medication, right? And so the pharmaceutical industry comes into play at this. And so if you don't need mental health to the level of pharmaceuticals and drugs, then guess
Right.
what?
You gotta be, you
You
gotta
don't
be
need it that
completely,
bad.
you gotta be
So you
completely
don't need your, we
unhinged
shouldn't have
and
to pay for
like
that.
beside yourself in order to access services. Which bananas to me.
Right. And so it's intentional because, right, like that's why we ain't cured nothing since polio, right? Right? There's cures out
That's
there, but they
right.
don't want to cure anything because it's about maintenance. How do we maintain this level of, so that people stay alive just enough to work hard enough that they don't use their resources and they won't qualify for
Yeah.
more resources so that we don't have to pay,
Yeah.
but
No,
they
listen,
still are making
I'm
us
just
money.
sick. I'm like hearing it makes me feel sick in my stomach because it feels so that there's a huge lack of integrity around, our field and, how the insurance companies come in and really do a lot of damage. And so in order to move forward, I wanted to see
Yeah.
if you can tell us a time that you've actually advocated against white supremacy in the mental health field and what the feedback was, or if you received any backlash, etc. Like, can you explain, share a time that you've tried to sort of advocate against white supremacy in the mental health field and tell us about what that was like?
That was an everyday struggle in the prison with those kids, right? You had literally, I believe, honestly, just to be put, people that were white supremacists,
Wow.
probably part of the Ku Klux Klan, in
Whoa.
there as officers. And those officers, I mean, there were times when there were officers that literally said, "I want to hang that nigger," in
No,
front of
they didn't.
black staff.
Like, white officers
And
said that.
then, oh hell yeah, they did, in front of black staff. And when black staff was up in arms, all that happened was they got shifted to a different shift, or they got shifted to a different cottage. Nothing happened. There was no backlash for that. They didn't care. And so every day, right? So one of the worst experiences that I've ever had in that experience of being in that space was having these kids be exposed to the same things that were out in the community. And in particularly, one CO was very engaged and provocative, and other staff members, other officers had video
With
footage
the
of them being sexual.
with the young people,
And
you
I
mean?
heard the kids over talking about it.
Oh, okay.
No, with other COs. But the COs were showing the videos to the residents. So the kids are seeing this female staff member be sexual, and there were multiple. And having brought that to the stage of the institution, and of course the kids aren't going to agree or say or any of that stuff, but people had their phones and all that stuff, right? And so it all got swept under the rug. And ultimately, one of the officers wound up being involved with one of the kids. And the kid got out, couldn't take it, wanted her to shift her whole entire life. And he wound up killing her and himself because he couldn't take it. But it was the fight of the clinician that was seeing that kid to get him through understanding the appropriate sexual boundaries about things, and fighting with the officers and fighting with the guards and the administration about these people recycling the experience of these kids process in the institution, and it falling on deaf
And did you
ears all the time.
And then
Even when
as
they
you
could see it
advocated on
happening, they
behalf
would
of the
ignore it.
people that were there, the young people that were there, did you experience any like backlash or anything?
Oh, so the officers had attitude with me, and they wouldn't. So they would. What would happen is they would negate to call my kids. Oops, right? Because I had to have my kids called over to me, and so they wouldn't call my kids.
Damn
And
it.
so now the kids aren't getting the services they deserve, right? So they're going to have a direct
Right.
impact on the kids while impacting my job, right? And there are officers that didn't like me, and personally, I don't care if you like me
That's
or
right.
not. I'm doing what I need to do. I'm doing what I feel is right. And so those were things that kind of happened, and it was just very disheartening. And so doing it for 11 years of trying to figure out, navigate, push, offer support in ways that
Right.
we couldn't right? Like trying to be ingenuitive and like, how do we bring in some more of this technology? How do we bring in creative ideas, right? And it was very clear to me that in that space that it was designed
Yeah.
to have those kids graduate
Okay, so it was like
into the
intention to
adult
keep them there,
system.
basically.
Yeah, it was that was the intention. It was like, we're gonna go, you'll go from here to there, right? And because the resources that they had when they got back to their communities, even the smartest of kids that had gotten into college and were doing college courses and doing well in college courses, when they got home, they didn't have the resources. The parole didn't support them, right? And so you could advocate and give them the resources, but those kids weren't about taking out,
Right, right, right.
$10,000 in student loans. Like the reason they were out there hustling was because they didn't have money in the first place, and they were trying to stack
Yes.
money so that they could have money for their life going forward. So
That
I'm
makes
going to take
sense.
out a loan
Right.
and owe somebody money?
You know,
Are you
I
crazy?
was thinking about and listening to your story when you talked
So,
about how the officers would be like white supremacists, right? My cousin told me a story about, his time
mm-hmm.
when he was locked up, and he was like upstate somewhere, and like I didn't even realize, like, when he shared this story with me, I was like blown away because he was talking about being upstate, locked up, and it was like basically, like a small like town with white people who were the residents who were also working as officers, and how you know um, the people who were black or brown, right, the inmates who were black and brown, were treated completely different than even the white inmates. And it really felt, according to what my cousin was telling me, it felt like a plantation, like in real life, right? And I never, because
Mm-hmm.
I never had that
Mm-hmm.
experience, going way upstate or anything like that. I never would imagine that that was what's happening right now in the prison industrial complex, where you're going into small little white towns, and you build a prison, and you have these guards who are mostly white, sort of acting like plantation owners. That's right.
And
That's
listen,
crazy
New
to me.
Jersey has a whole entire farm. They have a whole entire farm that's run by
That's
the
crazy to me.
prison, by
Like,
prisoners.
and it doesn't. You don't even have to be, because
Yeah,
you wasn't in a small
absolutely.
town, right? You was somewhere in New Jersey, right? Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
no, I was in New Jersey, but it was still a small town, right? And like there were people that lived in that town their whole life, so I got to hear the whole history of how at one point it was a boys' school and there was a whole bunch of land, and the kids worked the land, and there was no gate around it until the kids started escaping, and then they put a gate around it, right? So like there were a whole bunch of different things. One time, somebody had escaped from the local um, police custody, and they thought somebody escaped from the prison, and they were like, "Oh, somebody escaped from the prison! Oh no! Oh, oh, oh!"
Okay.
And somebody actually got away from the local cops, but they thought it was from the
Yeah,
prison
yeah, yeah.
because they just made it that narrative, you know. But and as I had to advocate in that space, it's one of those pieces of looking at how that institution parallels
Yeah, you said something about that
institution of
earlier.
higher
Can you like
learning,
expand on that real quick?
where yeah, and so
Wait. You got muted real quick. What happened? Okay, okay. Say that again. You got muted. Real quick. Yeah, I think you good.
oh my bad, I'm good. Yeah, so oh my bad. So the COs are the equivalent of this, right? The students are the residents, the professors and teachers are the custody staff, the deans and all of those
Mm-hmm.
people are the administration, right? And the mental health professionals are there to keep the keep people
Like in check, you
sane
mean?
enough that they don't
Yeah.
have a mutiny. Uh-huh. So that they
Oh
won't have an uprising in the
shit.
prison and overthrow the prison, because right, like there are more
Mm-hmm.
prisoners than there are guards. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There are more students than there are teachers. And if they're not sane enough to stay in school and
That's
spend that
right.
money, the institution don't exist. And so there's this checks and balance system, and all of them are in a state of transition
Yeah.
because none of them have really been away from home for real.
Uh-huh.
None of them, they're all learning new systems that they have to deal
Yeah.
with in their different schools or in that institution. And so a lot of them are brainwashed into believing they have to exist in a certain
Right.
way in order to get their education. They have to meet these certain level of expectations that aren't real. They're imaginary expectations that they have to meet, and
Yeah.
they make them reality to
Yeah.
themselves. And that's the only way I'm going to succeed, right? And in the prison institute, right, the kids figure out what they have to do in there to succeed. So if I smuggle this, if I sneak this, if I sneak that, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can live comfortably, right? And so they're figuring out how to navigate
Yeah.
their world to best do what they need to do, right? And so it's very paralleled, you know. And in the education institutions, the fight is
Hmm.
being able to help
Well,
these students
that's
liberate their
the
minds,
what they
right,
say.
and understand. Well,
Right.
right. Well, they'll say that in the institutional identity, but they're liberating their minds to being able to work for people for the rest of their lives, so that they can make other
Yeah.
people money in hopes that one day they'll be
Yeah.
rich too. And they sell them the pipe dream, right? The reality being for us, no, you don't need these people once you get out of here, right? You might need this piece of paper to do this certain thing, but you don't have to be or change
Right.
who you are to make them feel comfortable. Exist in you, exist in your own comfortability, so that you can be who you are wherever you are, and be comfortable in you, and let them feel uncomfortable, right? Like, this is the whole issue with the critical race theory, right? We're teaching, right? Is that people are struggling with it because, oh,
No
black and
way. You
brown
can't have
people being empowered to feel good about themselves, or recognize that they don't have to stand
no.
for white supremacy
The
anymore.
world is gonna burn.
They're gonna make me feel uncomfortable. Right. The reality is, sit in the
Yup.
discomfort. We've been uncomfortable for a really long time.
Yup.
We've played your game for a
And
long time.
what I'm hearing
Time to
about what you're
switch it up.
saying, the sort of parallels between education and the prison industrial complex, is really the intention is to keep people oppressed, right? To keep people, we condition people to be oppressed. And then it's interesting because I think about, for people who have
Mm-hmm.
to take out student loans because they don't have any other resources, it's almost like you thinking about somebody who has a criminal record, right? Somehow that student loan or that criminal record is going to sort of hold you back from moving forward.
Wait. Yeah, you're right. So the loan office
Yes,
is, that's
exactly.
parole. That's probation.
Right,
Right? Like,
exactly.
you
Exactly.
got to pay us,
That's right.
and we'll let you stay
Exactly.
free.
Well,
We'll keep your
I
FICO
never
score
thought of it
good as
that
long
way,
as you
but it
keep
makes a
paying
lot
us.
of sense. That's a great point that you made because
Mm-hmm.
we think a lot of times of education as being, the intention is to liberate our minds, but mostly it's to sort of, condition us to become oppressed as citizens. And so, yeah, no,
Right.
no. What are you
And
gonna say?
okay. Oh no, I was going to say, and that's the trick as growing up and being an adult and being a parent, particularly for me, is being able to be aware of that and what my conditioning is, right? And because, right, my conditioning has been conditioned, right? Whatever condition you had prior to going into college, it
Right,
gets
right.
reconditioned into you a bit more. And so the ability to take a step back and recognize, how do I not infringe upon my children's lives with the identities and the ideologies of white supremacy, so
Yeah,
that they can grow up
how
in
do they
their
know?
own authenticity, right?
Right.
And that requires me to check me, though, right? Like, I have to check me in many ways, in recognizing, ah,
Right.
I'm pushing an agenda here. Is that taken from who they are? Am I stealing part of who they are right now? Am I oppressing that? But that's what happened, and that's what happens in many other cultures, because they have such strong boundaries and identities, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can do that when everybody looks like you, right? Like, you can hold the structure of your cultural integrity and
Uh-huh.
identity when everybody looks like you. And that's
Uh-huh.
not to say that that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's to say that it's a thing that can
Right, right.
happen with less consequence, because everybody is
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
the same thing. So it's brainwashing, still, nonetheless. And, ultimately, depending on how much misogyny or any other thing that may be going
Uh-huh.
on in the space of that culture, it has its impacts.
Right.
And that shows up in our students all the time. And it's really another reflection of the white supremacy, and how colonialism has played into and
Lord.
impacted spaces over and over again, which then brings the narratives, because the only news that they see from America are the news that they put out there, and the only thing they ever show about black and brown people ain't good. The vast majority of our movies,
we
ain't looking like really good people, right? Right. While drinking our juice in the hood. Right. And so like we have that image that's projected there. So when they show up here, they've already got the colorism piece going on. Oh, you're black or whatever. And it's like, you're a threat, right. You know, not even knowing. Right. Like I've literally had students come to me and be like, I never thought this was going to work. Because I've never been around, I never knew a black person before.
I mean,
and
to you,
I'm ashamed of myself. Yeah, they've said that they were ashamed of themselves for doubting me because I was black, and they just never never had been around a black person. But it was based off of solely their experience from their country and what had been fed to them through media and propaganda. And so that's why supremacy goes across seas, man.
You know how I look, right? Like, I remember that I had a couple come to me as a therapist, and later on they told me, right? Like after like we done, had a relationship and so on and so forth. They said that when they first came in, that's not our therapist, is it? Like they was like, like I don't know about him, right? Because it was the way I look. I don't look like a therapist. And so, but I love that they were able to be honest with me about their perception of me, and they happen to be also Latino, right? And so, but I love the fact that they were able to be honest with me, because I know that that's the perception when people show up in my space and they see me and be like, that's not really a therapist. And so, and that's part of the same thing, white supremacist sort of standards, right? When we think about who's a mental health professional, who's not, I don't fit the image of that at all, right? I mean, so now with that being said, just to sort of wrap up now, can you give us like one sort of example of a solution, a possible solution that we can sort of consider in sort of dealing with white supremacy in the mental health field?
Sure. First things first, get rid of insurance, right? Like, can we restructure the insurance structure? Because I think that makes a whole big difference. But honestly, I think that it becomes the space of first getting past our own stigmas of mental health and getting past, that kind of mentality for men of having to be strong and not being able to cry, and having all of those types of stereotypes that say we have to be firm in a certain type of way, right? You feel what you feel it, and have conversations about it, right? I don't know if you watched Encanto, but like it's a whole movie about a social worker.
I didn't see
Encanto ain't nothing but a movie about a social worker. It starts off. It's a Disney movie about it's an awesome movie. You got to check it out.
Wait.
Encanto, and so it's this one.
Oh, so it's not Spanish, and you like messing it up.
No, E-N.
Isn't there like a movie called Encanto or something like that? There's a whole bunch of like ethnic movies in Disney.
Yeah. Okay. But yes, Encanto from Disney, and like the girl who is out there, like she starts off doing a genealogram of her whole family and talking about her family, and she like breaks each and every one of her family members down to bring them to their authenticity of understanding the pressures they're under and how they feel that imposter syndrome, and she breaks them all down until the whole house falls to pieces and then gets rebuilt. And so the reality is that we have to have these conversations within our own communities. We have to have these conversations with our own families. We have to be willing to be vulnerable, and vulnerable with our kids, vulnerable with those who are younger than us, to be able to say, like, no, it doesn't have to be this way. And so it starts there.
I feel like that's Spanish, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, that's
it
what I'm wondering.
The movie's it's about a Spanish family.
You're talking about the magic. When they say they can't call, like, is that the one that you can't call the uncle? That everybody's like raving about the uncle? Bruno? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Bruno. We don't talk about Bruno.
So I knew, but I knew
Bruno
that it
is
was.
the
I knew
identity
that it
of mental
sounded like you were
health,
saying
and we don't
Spanish, but
talk about it.
it didn't quite sound Spanish. But thanks for our audience members. A Colombian family.
Listen,
It is a
I ain't got
Colombian
those roots,
family.
brother. Sorry.
Oh, and you know, so interesting about that movie, you can see how colonization shows up in our family because we all look so different. I mean, you can see colonization right then and there, like right in that movie, like
Mm-hmm.
you saw. And you know what? It was so affirming to have a little character named
Yes.
Antonio. I just want to. It really was. I was like, that would have been me. Like if I was like in Colombia, like Puerto Rico, Africa, that would have been me. Yeah, he loved animals. Like
And he
that's
loved
totally
animals.
me. That's just
So
like stuff. So I hear being able to sort of normalize the conversation within our own families. And I don't know if you meant to say this, but like
yes.
abolishing the health insurance.
Yes. Oh no, absolutely. Abolishing the health insurance process. Absolutely. Right. Like there's a better way. Who was it? Michael Moore did a documentary on, and it was called "Who Do We Invade Next?" And it was based off of the best practices of medicine, healthcare. No, not sicko. No. It was called "Who Do We Invade Next?" So it looked at the best practices in medical, education, and all different types of social domains. And they one of the doctors, and I don't remember what country it was in, but they have universal health care. And he's like, the reality is, when it comes to being a doctor, it comes down to this. Do you want one bins or two? He's like, if you're not greedy like that, you can have universal health care and take care of people and pay financially and be okay. You don't have to have the capitalistic system of healthcare and have to capitalize off of people's illness and sickness. But so I think that piece would be the biggest piece that would change things. But I think at a grassroots level, it's being able to have the conversations about how people how particularly our children, how we're experiencing, how we're engaging in the world around us, and the impact of what's going on around us, and how we are recognizing our experiences of life, right? Because mental health is life, right? We have to understand that every interaction that we have with a person is an interaction of mental health. How they impact us, how we, right. How do we impact each other in this conversation? How do we impact the people that are listening, right? That's part of their mental health right now. We're contributing to that, right? I think, like everybody got up in arms about Whoopi saying that the Holocaust was about the inhumanity of man to man. We're gonna get canceled. I know, right? But that's what mental health is. It's the understanding of humanity and how we impact one another, right? Or what the inhumanities people have experienced based off of their lifelong traumas or the traumas of the life that they've lived thus far, and how to navigate that and how to instill humanity into one another.
When we say mental health, it seems so like disconnected from our humanity. It's like mental health is out there somewhere. But it really is about like the human experience, right? And how do we become sort of considering all the challenges that so many of us deal with, it doesn't even matter what race you are, right? How can we still become the best version of ourselves anyway, right? In the face of all these challenges. And I think when we talk about mental health, we almost disconnect it from the human experience, right? Like mental health, like it's away from me. Versus, let's talk about the human condition and what it is that we have to endure as human beings, and how we can support each other not to lose our motherfucking minds. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. That's it. 110%.
It really is a shit show. When I think about what it is that we deal with as human beings, it's a shit show, and there's nothing sort of in place to make it less of a shit show. And I feel like when I think at least about how white supremacy shows up in the mental health field, it sort of adds to the shit show, right? Because we're supposed to be accessing these sort of services or these spaces so that we can not be a mess, but yet we leave more messy because of the way the systems are structured and set up, including when you talk about like health insurance, including when you're thinking about how officers are in the prison industrial complex. And so all those things make it so that it continues to be a shit show. And you are, right? There you have it, like some of our
Right.
say. Well, anyway,
Right.
Shan, I really want to
Yeah.
thank you for joining this live. It's 7:59, and I'd like to make sure that, for the sake of people who are, visiting our live, that we always honor the time of 8 o'clock, so that we don't go overtime. And I want to give a shout out real quick, and then I'm gonna have you say some last things if you feel like it, Shan. To whoever's left in the building, we have. Thank you both, JP. That looks like Jaleesa because I already know her thing. We have Spicy Colombiana. That looks like Linda because I already know her thing because she's spicy. And then to the other people, I don't know if they're in the house, but to like the drive. I messed up your whole name right there. And something with Jules, I can't even see, Ocean Gems, something like this with the Ocean Gems. So shout out to you all if you're still in the room. Shan, is there anything you want to say to sort of exit us out? I appreciate you for being here. Oh, by the way, to the people who are listening, we have our next IG Live episode next week with one of our colleagues, Mr. Morris, Daniel Morris. He'll be our next guest. That'll be next Tuesday at 7 p.m., February 22nd. And then that'll be followed by the Freedom Fighters of the Minds next meeting, which will be Wednesday the 23rd at 7 o'clock p.m. If you're interested in any of that, please email me at antonio@theliberatedself.org so I can provide you with the Zoom link. So let me just shut up right there. Shan, so anything you want to say to sort of get us out of this, and then I'm going to find a way to shut this down because I don't even know how to shut it down because I always forget.
So, I got to give a shout out to my man Malvern for jumping up in here. He's one of my homies from college, and we rode that bad boy up in the midst of Whitesville, and he came out a registered nurse and did his thing, man. I got to give him mad loving, give him support, right? But no, I just got to say, be real with yourself. Be able to have these conversations if you have kids, have conversations with your kids. Challenge them to stretch their own imagination, challenge them to stretch who they are as individuals and not to see things through the lens of oppression, through the lens of doubt or being afraid of this world, but let them stand in boldness and be who they are and be for real themselves and get out of the way, right? We got to get out of the way. And the bigger and more important piece is get out of our own way, right? The things that we've grown up with, the stereotypes, the kind of traditions that have been unhealthy, the things that may cause some anxiety and fear within us, right? The worst part about anxiety is the fear that it creates. And the worst part about that is that in that fear, you're living in your own imagination. You're not even living in a reality, right? And so you need to lean into that. And whatever you're afraid of, because the fear is really, you're afraid of, being affirmed the negative thing. At least if you're affirmed the negative thing, you know how to act and how to change. Otherwise, you sit in a place of stagnation that's holding you back from your own growth. And so you may struggle through that, but anything that grows struggles. And if you're trying to grow, you got to struggle. And it's not comfortable, it's not fun, but it's going to take you to the next level of yourself in this journey called life so that you can be all that you want to be and be your best self. All right, definitely. All right, love, peace, and hair grease, bro.